Well, voyages of exploration and colonization and trade around the world introduced a wealth of new animals and a tidal wave of new and useful plants. Governments became increasingly interested in these new plants for their medicinal, economic, and scientific uses. Botanic gardens and private gardens flourished, herbaria and museums expanded, and horticultural expertise and the nursery trade grew. Well, it soon became apparent that there were many more species in the world than could be encompassed by the existing base of knowledge. And with few authoritative images to draw upon, botanists commissioned drawings of these new curiosities that demanded a higher standard than found in most of the early herbals. Now, to gauge this idea of progress, this advancement, this discovery, we can look at these great herbalists here. Leonard Fuchs of 1542, in his great herbal catalog, he lists 500 plants for the entire world. How fascinating. And the Italian herbalist Mattioli in 1544, he lists 1,200 plants for the world. And then Caspar Bahin, the Swiss naturalist and herbalist, 1623, 6,000 plants now known for the world. And then the salaried botanist at the Royal Academy of Sciences, the personal physician to Louis XIV, Joseph Tournefort, in 1700, 9,000 plants now known for the world. Well, the number of new species was growing almost exponentially, and botanists needed a more precise system of naming and arranging all of these plants. Well, during the Middle Ages and continuing into the Renaissance were a series of purely utilitarian types of classifications. For an example, botanists would classify herbalists medicine, food, or poison. That's a very simplistic classification. Or they would do it by trees, shrubs, and herbs. This simply wasn't going to cut it for all the many new species being discovered literally around the world. And so other attempts to classify plants were developed in the 17th century that were more natural, even long before Charles Darwin. But it was Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist, devised a practical system of plant classification in 1735 based on the structure, arrangement, and number of so-called sexual parts of the flower. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist and explorer, revolutionized botany and its illustration. His works, culminating with his Species Plantarum of 1753, established a new system for organizing and naming plants. Now that system standardized the plant name, genus, and species, and it simplified the dialogue about the thousands of new plants being discovered around the world. If you know not the names, said Linnaeus, there is lost also the knowledge of things. He understood perfectly well the elementary steps of naming and classifying were simply a means of access to and handling of a great variety of other kinds of information, including botanical illustration and floral art. His not to reason why, his but to classify. That was the job of that botanist. Well, the Linnaean system changed botanical illustration. The focus of the illustration shifted from the whole plant to the flower alone. The flower was more likely to be shown close up with each stamen and pistil distinct. And this contrasts sharply with the earlier work's attention, showing the plant as a whole, roots, stems, and leaves. Now, by the 18th century, botany, the science of botany, was dominated by this Carl Linnaeus. And the German artist George Ehret was the dominant influence in botanical art. By the end of the 18th century, a very different picture. Inaugurated with the works of artists von Spondonk, the Redoutés, Turpin of France, the Bauer brothers of England, was truly a remarkable age. They overshadow all the plant painters who came before or after them with their combination of artistic vision, botanical accuracy, and sheer quantity of output. This was the golden age when scientific inspiration reached aesthetic heights never surpassed before or since. And for this, Linnaeus' so-called sexual system of classification, with his emphasis on floral details, and then his binomial nomenclature for species, were in no small measure responsible for all of this change, even in the animal world as well. This is the golden age of scientific illustration, and this is the age of Redouté. In 1759, Redouté is born in the middle of a century of profound social, economic, and scientific change. Daily newspapers first appeared in England. There was a noticeable rise in the population with upper middle classes closely connected. Hospitals widely established. North America, at least the eastern part, already explored. Yes, beginning in 1635 with the great French naturalist and medical doctor Philippe Cornu, who published an illustrated catalog of Canadian plants growing in Parisian gardens. And Mark Catesby, the English naturalist and traveler, collected in Florida and elsewhere and wrote a book on the natural history of the region. The first American floras were published in 1739 and 1743. And John Bartram, that great American botanist, sent seeds and newly discovered plants from Pennsylvania and surrounding districts to Philip Miller, one of the greatest gardeners of all in Europe. And then Peter Kalm, a Swiss naturalist, botanized Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and southern Canada from 1748 to 1751. The 18th century has been justifiably called the Golden Age of Botany. It was a century of classification, of systematic hunting around the world, professionalism, research, and the beginnings of experimentation. And Redouté was at his prime and excelled as a botanical artist during this golden age of botany. Now, briefly, just a little bit about our painter here. Trained as a painter by his father and schooled in the great Dutch flower painting tradition. Now, at the young age of 13, Redouté left his southern Belgium home, traveling through southern Belgium with a letter of introduction from his father, painting these decorative works, these portraits, and these religious subjects, but he always kept coming back and painting that which he loved absolutely most, flowers and more flowers. Now, Redouté did this for about 10 years, until one day he received a letter from his brother in Paris, inviting him there to paint stage scenery for these Italian opera sets. Now, Redouté thought, well, boy, this will be fun. I'll be painting more plants, even though it might not be the exact plants that he really wanted to paint. So Redouté makes his way to Paris, and there he discovers the garden of all gardens, Jardin du Roi, the king's garden. And it came to pass that he met a very important person, the professor of biological iconography, Gerard von Spondonk, who introduced him to the iconography of the natural world. And from von Spondonk, he learned the technique of watercolor painting on vellum. Now, during his time and many visits to the garden, he also came to know and to meet a very wealthy amateur botanist, Charles-Louis Redouté de Breteuil, in a die-hard Linnaean. He's following that classification system of Linnaeus, including all the floral details. Now, Redouté is searching for an illustrator for his own works. He's doing all these publications and he needs an illustrator, and so he cannot help but notice the incredible talent of this young artist. And so he hires Redouté to work for him, and then instructs Redouté in the characters needed by a botanist. And on the basis of the knowledge acquired from Redouté, Redouté is able for the first time to make his pictures scientifically exact. During his early creative period, it is merely the academic representation, very naturalistic and botanical, and in these senses extremely valuable, that prevails over any aesthetic demand. Now, I wished I had an image of this Redouté, but apparently not a single image, sketch, or anything exists of him in any of the great libraries anywhere around the world. Redouté, a very wealthy amateur botanist, there's a little bit known about him, but he was producing these sumptuous botanical books, illustrating some of the exotic species of plants then being introduced into the gardens of Europe. His Stirpes Nova of 1784-85 is one of the more delightful flower books of the 18th century. Splendid in its spacious descriptions, its exotic and charming plates, its implications for taxonomic history. This was Redouté's very first scientific publication, and his collaboration with Redouté was truly decisive. It was a turning point in this young artist's career.